Alright folks, this is the full, uninterrupted MASKENBALL Weathering Masterclass. If you missed part 1 or 2, no worries, I've stitched them together into one streamlined session so you can follow the entire process from start to finish. This isn't just about slapping on some scratches, we're layering depth, pushing realism, and dialing in that gritty, lived-in look that makes a model feel like it's been through hell and back. We'll cover everything from surface prep, chipping and decals to oil streaking, grime layering, and the final finishing techniques that pull it all together. So grab your thinners, your brushes, and probably a coffee because this is going to be a deep dive into next level weathering. First off, let's prepare the surface with the subtle abrasion weathering technique. Wet polishing the grey-violet camo paint develops subtle scuff marks in chipping through to the underlayers. The brush marks infused into the surface become usable texture, which the sanding sponge can catch on and remove. Now, great care and restraint are needed here. We're only sanding very thin layers of airbrush paint, and they don't have any filler or substrate beyond what's contained within semi-gloss Mr. Color. Yes, of course, you can go down to the red oxide primer if you're brave enough. This technique also flattens the paint finish, making it perfect for upper-facing horizontal surfaces. The effect mimics UV degradation, not so much by fading the paint, but by making it appear dulled and flattened. The gun arm gives us fantastic opportunities for longitudinal and edge effects with this gentle abrasion technique. Now remember, chipping doesn't always need to be overt. Paint bruises and scrapes add a great deal of life and depth to our finish, and this is an excellent way to produce them. Experiment and observe closely. Similarly, the longitudinal effects work beautifully on the Neue Panzerschreck launches. This is also where we can take care of the step left behind by our sharp masking during the previous paint steps. Have a really close look at my gallery shots and you'll see the fine damage, depth and realism I've been able to produce in this area. This step and technique lay a strong foundation for that look. If you want to go into more detail with this technique, I suggest my abrasion weathering video I showed you on the Alter Hund if you're keen for more. So these shoulder armor pieces have gone through what I'll jokingly call the buffing, and they're now ready for, again I'm kidding, but the glossing. Yeah, I know I talked about using the buffing process, the abrasion, to remove the gloss and flatten it, but trust me, it'll return. That's the fascinating part of this process. By flattening the paint surface, we create a dynamic effect where the gloss and matte qualities will shift back and forth, just like things do in real life. New paint is usually pretty glossy and then it gets beat up and goes flat. I don't usually show varnish effects on my builds, but the questions come up often, and I felt this particular build was a great opportunity to share how I get the decals to blend in beautifully. You know, most of the time. Yeah, no kidding. This is another step, and it's not 100% necessary at all, but if we want to invest the effort, in this build in particular, I felt it was worth it. I'm using Mr. Color Super Clear GX100. It's a fantastic clear gloss coat. Big fan. I keep it slightly thicker than my color coats, so I'm spraying it about 50-50 mixed with Mr. Color Self-Leveling Thinner. It's the Sex Panther of clear coats, but better, I swear. For this step, I hammer it on pretty hard. Not fire hose, rattle can hard, but I'm not shy with it either. No mist coats here. It needs to be thick enough to settle into a nice shell coat. Yes, I spray it all over the different paints, including water-based acrylics, as long as they've had enough time to cure. A rule of thumb, 24 hours and you're golden. Now a quick, lazy pro modeler bench tip. I keep a line of tape on my clear glass paint bottle jar to eyeball my clear coat mixes. It's fast, easy and pretty idiot-proof. I pour in the GX100 until it visually covers the tape. Then I squirt in the Mr. Color Self-Leveling Thinner all the way up to the top and boom, I'm ready to spray. Works every time. Now check out this number 2 decal. The design and quality are fantastic. Full opacity, dense ink coverage, and 100% color fast. Naturally this comes with a trade-off in thickness, but we can work with that. The first step is to seal in the decal with more gloss clear. Yes, I'm using more GX100. Well-equipped modelers might want to upgrade to a larger airbrush nozzle for this, like a 0.5mm. I might splurge on one for some of these large airplane kits I've got coming up, but for the moment now I just use this 0.3mm nozzle on these mecha-sized kits and make it work for everything, just like I have to. Yes, in the past I've used a spray can for this step as well, and it's viable, though more expensive per action and spray. Although, once I've added up the cost of getting everything, I do wonder. Walking the mile, walking the mile. I'm polishing the parts, I'm polishing the parts. Now, using that same sanding sponge with the 800 grit, I've wet polished the edges of the decals. You'll see them disappear as you smooth down the edge. Then I come back again with GSX 114 Super Smooth Clear, my new favorite flat coat. Yes, the sanding residue of the lacquer clears blends into the next sprayed coat as they are held in suspension when they re-wet with the paint and thinner mix. This may take multiple coats as you learn this skill, so be patient. This is a pretty high-spec finesse move, not a first swing easy home run kind of thing. You will improve with practice, I promise. I see this as a continuation of surface preparation and an important step in both detailing and preparing the model for weathering. It seals in the weathering steps, prepares the surface for decals, which add a ton of detail and sharpness to your model, and then further blends everything together for that painted on look. You can see, even here with the largest decals in the kit, they've been blended in perfectly. They look like they're in the paintwork, and the reason is because they really are. This elevates your finish a great deal. Now I have some follow-up process points because I know you'll have questions. Now first, yes, you can do this more than once. The gloss coats, the buffing, the flat coats can all be repeated as needed. Just inspect your finish and learn from it. The airbrushed clear varnish coats may take longer to harden up, likely because the rattle can versions we use contain hotter chemicals, or maybe I'm just losing my sense of time due to those hotter chemicals. Oh, sweet, sweet Mr. Superclear fumes. Next, be patient with gloss coats. They tend to go on thicker and just need more time to settle down and harden up. If they feel tacky or the sanding sponge grips the surface too much, it's better to back off and come back later. And lastly, I know this because yes, I have messed them all up. I'm impatient too. Yep, I'm sharing hard-won experience, and I hope the heads up makes you feel better when you do exactly the same thing too. Alright, quick pit stop in our MASKENBALL journey. I've got some exciting news. The hard proof for my new Volume 3 Hund book just arrived, and it's absolutely fantastic. And guess what? This very MASKENBALL project is featured inside. Let me show you real quick. If you want to dive deeper into the build details and see some more epic shots, you can reserve your copy now, exclusively at Paint on Plastic. This book is only available directly from me, no resellers, no middlemen, just straight from my workbench to your hands. It's a limited run, so if you're thinking about grabbing one, don't wait too long. Alrighty, book update over, let's get back to the weathering hijinks. Now with a reasonably flat finish, I'm ready to continue on with what most folks probably think of as the traditional weathering steps. And that should probably answer the question, which surface type do you like to work from, Link? Faux paint chips using water-based acrylics, and much like the paint scheme design, I went with a reasonably complex approach using a range of colors. The first step was with a light blue, or again, Hellblau, to help sell the illusion of the upper paintwork chipping away to reveal the light blue underneath. I found it to be a very pleasing color to work with and experimented with both a wet palette and, just a milk bottle lid to help the paint become a little thicker. Sometimes I feel the wet palette working against me for steps like this because it can lead me to over-thinning the paint, whereas the milk bottle lid, it helps me to work in short bursts with maximum opacity of the paint as it was designed. Just showing you what happens to me, of course. You do you. After the light blue, I opted to go one layer deeper and add fresher chips in red oxide color, representing slightly darker chips that can go down to the primer. Not too many, just enough to add a taste of complexity and bring more dark red to the finish, which works fantastically well with this colorway. That's right, one of the things I love about a sci-fi finish is that we can choose the colors that work well and look good, and just nudge them into looking real. That's something I experimented heavily with in my Hund finishes, but especially these latter ones. I'll show you what I mean on another one soonish. After establishing a good amount of the lighter chipping, I've come back with a dark brown, the one I like to use. It reads perfectly as a dark ferrous oxidization chip color, even on machines that aren't meant to be made from ferrous composites. Shh, that secret stays between you, me, and YouTube. I've mostly kept these tight and brush applied, but I did also use a couple of the ye olde bathroom sponge ring chips because, I just really like how they look. Now I could have edited this to make it look like this was my plan all along, but I felt a little transparency might actually help my friends with their modeling choices. Looking at the chipping so far, I felt it needed more larger, more impactful chipping to really sell the head picture image I had in mind. So I've come back and gone for more. I know it sounds funny, but many of you don't need to hear this, but I also know there are folks out there who are like me that do need to hear it, so this is for you. Yes, we are allowed to do additional rounds of processes to make the model look right to us. I remember when this concept clicked for me, and honestly, it's really helped my modeling. So I've come back and loaded up my big old wedge of cheese sponge to lay down some larger, longer scratches. Then I've augmented them with painted in effects, like adding scratch lines connecting the flaked off patches and extending some details to make them sharper and more accentuated. Please revel in this freedom to just make it look cooler. And the best part, if you don't like your handiwork, you can instantly backpedal with a little water and a Q-tip. Just make your corrections quickly, because if you let the paint harden or cure, well, we don't do that, do we? Now you old friends who've been watching me for a while will know that I usually go from the feet up, but you've noticed on this Hund I've gone top down. And yes, it changes things. Now ask yourself on your next model, do you go harder or softer pull back with your weathering at the beginning or the end of a project? Honestly, the answer doesn't matter as much as I just want you to know you so that you can be mindful of when to push yourself instead of backing off. I gradually built up the testicular fortitude to push harder at the end. And this time it worked for me. These harsher feet chips turned out great. I kept them angular using a wet sponge and pushed the effect as far as I could stand it. And you know what? I'm really happy with it. Did it need a little dialing back? Well, yeah, but I love knowing that I pushed myself as far as I could. Alright, let's talk depth, panel lines, detail accentuation, and the dirty kickoff. All of this happens in this step. It might look simple, but I've realized that I actually do a whole bunch of things with this dark brown oil paint. So I figured it's best to just show you, talk you through it, and let you pick up the ideas as we go. Kind of like hand brush color coats with lacquer paints. This isn't a 1-2-3 technique. It's more of a just paint it and get good at it move. And I mean that in the kindest way possible. I love this step, and honestly it's probably the #1 move that makes link models look like link models. So if you like how my stuff looks, spend extra time and care decoding this one. Now the product and alternatives. Does it have to be this product? No, it doesn't. Do I like this product? Yes, I do. Has the maker changed this product? Yes, they have, and they will change it again. That's what they do. What is it, and can you replicate it? Sure, you can. It's dark brown oil paint with a little odorless thinner and probably a couple of additives that help it dry and cure faster. Do you need to add those additives? No, but they do help, and yes, that's why I like using it. That said, I won't lose sleep once I use it all up. For a homebrew solution, I'd suggest burnt umber for the brown wash, and a 50-50 mix of lamp black and burnt umber for the dark wash. But of course you can alter that to taste. The small amount of odorless thinner added to the product allows it to flow into panel lines and around details while still being thick enough to pool where needed. I like to let it dry and have experimented with how long to wait. Surprisingly, it's still workable even after a full 24 hours sitting on the bench. So I suspect it lasts longer, but I'm not going to risk it. There's nothing in it for me to test the absolute limits, but I figured you might like to know my experience with it. Now, the 3 main ways to use it. If I had to write the textbook on this technique again, and remember, I have, for the Sci-Fi FAQ for this product's maker, I'd say there are broadly 3 ways to use it. Number 1 would be fine brush application into careful details. Number 2 is heavy but controlled application. This is what I'm mostly showing you today. It slightly overloads the details with the plan to cut it back later, letting the after effects do some of the work. And number 3 would be a full-on gunk wash application. Yeah, honestly, I think that last one is a bit of a waste for an expensive commercial product. If you're going to go all in on a gunk wash, I'd recommend going homebrew for more control, and yes, I've got some examples of that coming up for you in future videos. Now, for the actual process, this is the heavy application, and I'm using the thinness out of the bottle to let it flow naturally into details. Then I let it dry, allowing it to settle back into its oil paint form. Next, I take a soft, flat brush and chop it back to produce tighter lines with a blur around them. I use it to create general brown, dark brown, blurring effects with the oil paint. You see what I mean? It's just one product, more or less, but there are quite a few effects and ways to use it. Please have fun doing it. I know I do. This is one of my favorite processes. Mr. Weathering Color 02 Ground Brown. This series, and I only have a couple so far, is pretty new to my workbench. I've tested them a few times in different ways, but I really liked how they worked on the MASKENBALL. At first, I expected them to be just another brown paint in thinner in a bottle solution, but no, they're actually quite good. I suspect they're a mix of oil paint, an acrylic curing medium, and a mineral spirit-based solution that also contains naphtha. You can smell it. This time I've used them for pinpoint, tighter applications for intense filth, the kind that accumulates on a machine in hard use. I've used a slightly blunt size 1 brush, half loaded, to create spots a couple of millimeters across, a size that reads well on a hund. I've also thrown in a few bigger ones in certain spots, still very much experimenting with this particular paint. Here are a few spots I made earlier, left to dry for a few hours, and I found that this is a good consistency to work into the paint for some cool effects. For this step, I've chosen a Tamiya modeling brush HF, the smaller flat brush in the pack. I start to carefully stipple and work the paint into the surface. Right away, you can see it matches up with the other weathering effects I've already built up. The paint has more flatness and staining power than regular oil paint. It really sticks to the surface. Now, I'm not just stippling. As I work it up to the panel lines, I'm letting it blur along the details, almost like an accent wash to add depth. On the ear section here, I've blended it into a previous streaking effect, developing it into a darker form of the base color, and it blends beautifully. I'm very impressed. Larger spots work too, and I've used them to discolor the grey paint, starting from the top corner across and down. This helps sell the idea that the discoloration is happening from above, accentuating the MASKENBALL's paint scheme. I've done the same techniques on the opposite corner, working it over the light blue and yellow sections. This time I've left it less blended and more visible to counter the effects on the opposite top corner. Does that make sense? It's about balance, blending just enough to look dirty and natural, but not so much that it disappears. Playing with that balance is key. Now, dry time and real-time performance show off. Now, coming back to the dots we placed at the beginning of this section, let's see how they behave when worked at different drying times. It's been about 6 to 7 minutes in real time, and you can instantly see the paint is much softer. In one way, it's easier to blend, but at the same time, it's less durable for finessing. I'm not saying that's good or bad, just a Vulcanian observation on how the product performs relative to the drying time. I actually really like this effect. It almost looks like a scorch mark at this stage. It will fully cure overnight and be impervious to rubbing off, In 24 to 48 hours, it will be completely solvent proof. So yeah, that's a big thumbs up from me. Tamiya Weathering Master Set B. Let's noob out. I remember buying this product when it first came out way too many years ago. And to be honest, I didn't have high expectations, but over the years, I've used it countless times, even as my eye and skill improved. Despite mastering other products and techniques, I kept coming back to this one, and I have to admit, it just works. It's definitely worth including in your big book of magic spells. Now the funny thing, I bet many of you are like me and you only ever use the very dark brown soot and the warm dark brown rust, while the snow remains almost untouched. Not to worry, we will figure out a use for it. I have used it a few times, mostly as a highlight, but we'll come back to that. Now for the application, it's super simple and it's super effective. The application couldn't be easier. This time I'm just using the little foam brush that's included, gently rubbing it into the pressed pigment compound on the tabi, the warm brown rust side, and then buffing it into the surface. Why this works? It's an accurate application. You can be very strategic with the placement. It's perfect for discoloring decals. It helps them look dirty and naturally worn, and it accentuates panel lines and edges, adding depth and realism. The foam applicator is quite cleverly shaped. The rounded tip allows for precise placement inside panel lines and recesses, and the flat side works for overbrushing, plate edges and broad surfaces. Other tools work too. You can use a well-loved brush to adjust the effects and blend them into the surface to get exactly the look you want. Now what is this stuff? Let's have some science time. Alright, I know some of you will have questions. Let's answer the big one. What the heck is Tamiya Weathering Master actually? Tamiya Weathering Master is a waxy, water-soluble pigment system, and fun fact, its composition is surprisingly similar to cosmetic eyeshadow. Here's why. The binder and texture, just like eyeshadow, Tamiya Weathering Master uses fine pigment powder suspended in a waxy, semi-solid base. It's soft, easily picked up with a sponge applicator, and designed for sheer, buildable layering, exactly like cosmetic products. It can be blended with water, but once dried, it adheres well without being fully water resistant. It works via matte pigment deposition, meaning it sticks really well to the surface. The application and finish, where eyeshadow is applied in thin layers, apparently, blends smoothly and allows for controlled shading, Weathering Master does exactly the same thing. Now the formula and ingredients. Many modelers have tested and compared Weathering Master to drugstore matte eyeshadows. That's where I read about this. And they perform almost identically in terms of adhesion, blending and finish. So yes, you could totally use eyeshadow as a budget alternative for weathering effects. Just be ready to explain yourself if you're lurking in the makeup aisle. No judgment. But that's why my eyeshadow comes from Tamiya, even though it doesn't really suit my complexion or skin type. Just kidding. Now, preserving the finish. Do handle with care. Yes, this will leave fingerprints, so handle carefully. Yes, a flat, clear coat will preserve the finish and prevent smudging. No, it doesn't really cure. It remains somewhat removable. And yes, it needs a matte surface to adhere properly. Now, power move warning. Please use with restraint. One final note. This stuff is muy powerful. It can create a huge visual impact in a very short amount of time, and if you overdo it, it can quickly overpower the model. Use care and restraint. My favorite word, right? Like any good magic spell, it's strong in the right hands, but it can get out of control fast. Alrighty, a quick pit stop because I've got something special for you. The print edition of my new Volume 3 Hund book is here, and let me tell you, it looks absolutely killer. And guess what? This very MASKENBALL project, these exact all-weathering techniques are all featured inside. Let me show you. So if you're serious about pushing your builds further and want to see all the details in glorious close-ups, you can grab your copy now, exclusively at Paint on Plastic. This book is only available direct, no resellers, no middlemen, just straight from my workbench to your hands. My mind to your mind. It's a limited run, and once they're gone, they're gone. So if you want in, now's the time. Alright, book update over. Let's get back to making this thing look properly beaten up. Oil paints, wet and dry. So far, we've been building up what I'd call the legacy weathering, the kind of surface discoloration that happens over time as the unit ages. But these final effects, I call this environmental weathering. The more recent effects caused by the imagined environment the unit's operating in. Do they need to match the legacy weathering? Nope, they don't. But they do need to have some logical sense for them to read as, realistic. Since my surface is more on the greyish side with the urban camo and backstory, I wanted the feet to contrast while still staying with the overall scheme. So I went with yellow, earthy tones and chose Ochre oil paint from MIG Productions. Just a quick note for general knowledge. Paint names in this range are just product names. They don't necessarily reflect the true colour. But this one, it's a pretty close example of, a nice example of Ochre. It now sits in a similar place to our ID bands, but reads as earthy to my eye, and I'm really happy with this choice. Now the application, dry and direct for a heavy build-up. So I let the paint dry out on a little piece of cardboard, then apply it liberally in the same direction as the chipping, so it feels like it's stuck to the Hun's feet as it was walking. This adds a sense of motion and interaction with the terrain. No thinner, no additives, just straight, thick overbrushing. This is a perfectly fine way to apply oil paints, and it's most satisfying and painterly. But be careful. It's still soft, and it will fingerprint and smudge if it's handled too soon. Let it sit for a day or two, and it will air dry and harden up. Over several days, it'll fully cure and become impervious to solvents if you need it to be. For me, since this is a final finishing move, I just apply it and leave it alone. Now, I've got a little director's cut moment here, my happy little accidents. One thing I noticed and remembered, while my brush is loaded, I'll often apply a little of the color onto other areas of the model. Is it a realistic choice? No, not necessarily. But does it help tie the colors together and add cohesion? Absolutely. Classic painters reuse colors in different areas of their work to bring everything together. And while we're not doing classical art, we can absolutely borrow inspiration from them. I mean, steal cool stuff. Look at all them happy little tree accidents. Love this color. This was a great choice, Link. Now for some dark smoke effects, a kind of controlled dirtying. I also did a similar dry overbrush on the back of the engine area using the same brand's smoke color. It's not bad. It's a very dark greenish grey that gives a softer effect than pure black. This isn't a power move, but it adds a nice subtle touch to the finish. It's worth playing around with it if you're feeling it. Since the paint is quite dry, I used a very rough application, mostly with vigorous stippling and scrubbing. Oil paint is a nuanced medium. You can apply it softly and delicately, or you can go rough and visceral like I did here. Don't be shy with it. Make it bend to your will. You are the paint master. The layered patina these effects created was super rewarding, and it's something I want to develop even further with future builds. Now I wanted to push the other end of the spectrum, adding light, dusty effects. These tend to settle on the tops of vehicles and mecha, in recesses, and the contrast helps to highlight details beautifully. For this I use two colors I really like. Buff, a classic light ochre tone, and light mud, a slightly greenish hue just to mix things up. Fun fact, buff is technically yellow ochre mixed with white, so if you don't have it, you can just mix your own. And yes, I know, I have way too many paint colors. Don't judge me, man. We all have special needs and desires. Mine, a stupid amount of paint colors. It's a real sickness. Doctors, medicine, everything. But I know I'm not alone in this. Matte effect thinner. Is it a gimmick? Is it really a thing? To be honest, I don't think so. It's likely just some flat base mixed into odorless thinner, which you can buy separately from paint vendors like Tamiya or Mr. Color. One thing to note though, it does need to be shaken up since the flattening agent doesn't stay in suspension. Does it work? I mean, sure, I guess, but the flattening effect is mostly from pulling linseed oil out of your oil paints, which you can do with cardboard and so on, and then using regular odorless thinner with it. But hey, I'm here to give you my honest take, not to sell you more unnecessary products. I mean, I already do that with all my books and kits, right? As a big time enabler. But you need them for the inspo. Now I know there's proper ways to do this according to the Emperor of Painting rules on YouTube. But I figure I'll just show you the dumb way I do things because sometimes they work. Yes, I sometimes do the nice way. I apply tiny dots of oil paint, switch brushes to apply thinner and work the paint in, then switch to a dry brush to spread it around. Yes, I also do this. But sometimes, man, I just jab my manky brush straight into the oil paint and slap it on the model and judge how much thinner it needs. Then I jab the same brush into the thinner, straight back to the model and just paint it in. Make it work. A quick zip across kitchen paper under the paint palette and it's ready for another go. I know there's talk out there about, oh, don't get cardboard fibers in your paint mix. But come on, let's be real. If you're using a chunk of cardboard as a wet mixing palette, then that one's on you. I keep my thinners well away from the cardboard. I'm only touching my brushes to the paint, not soaking the cardboard itself. All my mixing and wet blending happens on the model itself, where it actually matters. I just don't have the time to waste faffing around, and I imagine you don't either. Now that I've explained how I do everything wrong, and admitted it to YouTube, let me show you how to, air quotes, do it correctly. Jokes aside, my main point is to humorously share that all of these are viable ways to paint our models. The only thing that actually counts is the final finish, and there are plenty of ways to get there. One thing I like about the toothpick application is that it lets me see exactly how much oil paint I'm depositing and gives me direct tactile feedback on the state of the oil paint. For example, I could feel that the buff oil paint was still a little soft, while the light mud had firmed up significantly. Do I have a secret strategy for handling this though? Well, no, not really, but by knowing this yourself, you'll start building up a mental library of how different oil paints behave at different thicknesses and drying times. This is the kind of experience-based knowledge that makes weathering techniques instinctive over time. Since I'm working off this red oxide color, I wanted to play around with shifting some of my dust effects by introducing light blue, or hellblau. Also, side note, while my German language skills are still functionally useless, at least I can point to light blue and make myself understood. Great success. But seriously, why use light blue here? It unbalances the red oxide frame in a way that creates visual interest and adds realism to the overall color composition. The buff oil paint is warm, and it reminded me of the times that Ko-sensei talked about using discords, such as red and green together, to create beautiful, complex hues. Color theory moment, why this works. Red and green are complementary colors, opposites on the color wheel. When mixed, they neutralize each other and create a range of rich browns, muted reds, deep olive greens, and earthy grays. This technique is used in fine art and scale modeling to create more naturalistic tones, rather than the plastic artificial look of straight from the tube colors. Now, mixing light blue and buff isn't quite the same discord as red and green, but it does create a temperature and saturation shift that results in some very pleasing, naturalistic tones. For example, if you mix them evenly, you get a soft neutral grey. If you put more blue into it, you get a muted teal or grey-blue. If you add more buff, you get a warm grey or a subtle khaki. Since I'm using the Hund frame as the mixing palette, I've shifted the mix around to further randomize the effects. I also added a couple of dots of burnt umber, which is more or less a dark neutral, just to mix things up and add some shadow effects. bringing it all together, blending and mini washes. Now I load up a brush with thinner and get to work. For this, I use a very well-worn round brush which has a diffused impact point to partially melt and soften the oil paints. Some sections I blend into mini washes. Other sections I leave as direct paint effects. I do all of this on the fly, adjusting based on how the effects are shaping up. The key is to work the areas that need more blending but also back off early to preserve the effects that already look good. And here's a pro tip. Instead of constantly reaching for more paint, I use the brush-borne mix solution and leave it on other parts of the model. This keeps the process flowing naturally and helps ensure some consistency in the finish. Different brush dryness equals different effects. Another thing to try is to vary your brush dryness. As your brush transitions from being loaded with thinner to just slightly damp, it shifts from being a wash depositor to a blending tool. This lets you lay down stronger marks when the brush is wetter. Blur and fade effects as the brush dries, then control how sharp or diffuse the oil effects look. Now, mistakes though, who cares? Because that's how you'll learn. Yeah, I know this run and gun wet blending approach can quickly lead to a muddy mess, but that's okay. As wise old Jakey the dog from Adventure Time says, the first step in getting good at something is sucking at something. And you can always remove an effect if you don't like it. Let it dry and try again. That's all part of the joy of modeling, and you will improve with each run at it, I promise. And of course, if you buy my books, bro. Well, working intuitively, keeping the process fluid. One of the biggest things I want to stress is I don't work in isolated little sections. Instead, I keep the balls in the air. Phrasing link. Working with what the model is giving me at any given moment. By doing this, I can react to how the colors are interacting. I can target different areas at the right moment. I can let the brush do the work rather than forcing an effect. Some sections make sense to hit first when the brush is wet with thinner, while other sections should be targeted later as the brush dries. This approach makes the process lively, fluid, and organic. Your brain can process more input than you realize, so just drink it all in, adapt, and enjoy mastering the outcome. Refining the details, switching down in gears. So at this point, I dropped down to a smaller brush and went back to a wetter approach. A finer, pointier brush lets me augment details more precisely, tighten up certain areas for a more refined outcome. Could I do this all with the same brush? Sure, but the outcome would just be different. The best way to learn is to study and experiment with it yourself. Give it a go and let me know what you think. I would love to compare notes. The bonus round of the final touches. Sometimes you reach the finish line on a project, but there are still few areas that need the touch-ups and weathering, or maybe you just feel like it needs one more round. But by now, you've probably already thrown out your chunko cardboard and your oil paints are hard as a rock. So here's my truth bomb share on the oil brusher products. They're actually good. They work as advertised and I do like them. But they never seem to make it into my first round picks. They're always on the bench until late in the game when the coach finally decides to give them a couple of minutes of field time so that they didn't suit up for nothing. A couple of my oil brushes now have cracked lids. They still work okay, but none have dried up, so that's good. And I got this set way back when they first came out in, I think it was 2017. So, not bad. And I do like using earth, and I like saying it in Japanese, and they pronounce it ass. And dust. Sorry, there's nothing funny about that one. A couple of spots, a quick blend, and we can salute and call it mission accomplished. Now, for a bonus tip, if you want to get some extra practice, you can do a little on the inside of your armor pieces too. Yes, sometimes these are visible in photos, and trust me, you don't want to have a beautifully weathered machine with a perfect, spotless factory finish inside the armor plates in a blow-up photos from like one of my books. That would be tragic. I'd mock myself unmercifully. You are a failure. Alright, that's the full MASKENBALL Weathering Masterclass, from factory fresh to full-on battle worn. This project was a blast, and like all weathering work, it's a balance between control and chaos. Some of the best effects came from planned layering and skill, but sometimes those unexpected happy accidents are true gifts from the weathering gods. Small g. Lessons learned. Well, oil layering, it's all about patience and smart color choices, cohesive color combos, yep, that magical triple C, and subtle blends, they work together beautifully. Mr. Weathering Color, this stuff is a winner. It's getting more time on the field and off my bench, and I'll be experimenting with expanding my color range. Tamiya Weathering Master, it just works every time. The extra realism it adds in final photos is undeniable. Every project like this refines my approach, and hopefully you picked up something that'll take your own builds to the next level. If you found something that's going to level up your builds, mash that like button, because you are the boss of the algorithm. And I want to hear from you. What was your biggest takeaway from this build? What's your go-to oil weathering move? Drop a comment below. I read and try to reply to them all. If you want early access to upcoming projects and behind the scenes content, join the Brobot crew on Patreon. That's where I share bonus videos, sneak peeks, and where our community of modelers is absolutely crushing it, with builds like Desert Storm and Naval Warfare. If you want to build alongside some of the best and level up your skills, that's where you've got to be. And if you want to see even more of the MASKENBALL in high detail, grab your copy of Volume 3 Hund before they're gone. Links below. Thanks for hanging out, and see you in the next one.